So why don't we start from the beginning? When did you first start investigating this?
The Colorado Attorney General's office started an investigation of child sex abuse by clergy in the Catholic Church in August of 2018, after the Pennsylvania grand jury report was issued by the Attorney General's office there. And we began to get phone calls in our office from people who had been victims of clergy child sex abuse, who wanted us to know their stories and who wanted to encourage us in Colorado to follow suit and do what Pennsylvania had done.
What was your reaction when you started getting those phone calls?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's gut-wrenching to hear people's stories, because some folks don't want to talk, but some want to tell you what their experience was. And those are such emotional conversations. Then we had a visit from members of SNAP, the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, and they are so genuine about wanting to protect other victims, but that involves telling their stories and exposing their own emotions, and those are very difficult conversations to have.
It's a tremendous amount of trust to talk to you about that.
It is, and these are folks who will tell you they were not able to talk about the abuse that they suffered at the hands of a priest until they were an average of 52 years of age. And a couple of these gentlemen are now in their 70s and 80s and have said, it was so hard for us to approach this, to acknowledge that the church that we loved was potentially covering up abuse that we had suffered, and we didn't want our parents to know. We didn't want our families to be aware of the abuse and be disappointed in us. There's a real element of shame involved in these stories.
When you first started looking into this and you first reached out to the Catholic Church, did they deny any of the allegations?
The first conversation that I had with counsel for the church was to ask if my office was considering any investigation of the church, which I confirmed. And they said, you know, we believe that there have been no instances of abuse in the Colorado Catholic Church since at least 1998, and that when we have heard allegations of abuse, we have reported those to law enforcement authorities. My reaction was, that's terrific news. If that is in fact the case, let's sit down and talk about that, because that is an important story to tell. But we also need to go back and we need to validate for the victims going back decades that the church is going to acknowledge their abuse and name the priests who were involved. We need to go back to 1950 so that those who are still living and living with the shame of having been abused by a Catholic priest, they can see that the church is owning that and acknowledging what happened to them.
When you continue that conversation, what was that? It required a lot of persistence on your part and your team's part. What did that include, that back and forth with the church?
Let me explain a little background. So the first thing that I did was bring together my senior management, a chief deputy, attorney general, and the chief of staff, both women, Melanie Snyder and Leora Joseph, and we sat down and had conversations about what we could do in Colorado in the limited time that we had left in my administration, because I was not returning as Attorney General. This was before the November election in 2018. We didn't know who the successor was going to be, and so we knew if we were going to act, we had to do it quickly. So we began having conversations with the church. They did come to the table and meet with us, and that one of those meetings included the Archbishop and the Bishop for Pueblo and members of the church's executive team. So I was very appreciative of the fact that they were willing to sit down and talk about the issues. It took months to put together an agreement. And just like any contract negotiation, people had to give, and we had to have passionate discussions about what needed to be in that agreement in order to get to a final product. I think both sides came away feeling that we had gotten some of what we wanted, but not all, and that's a fairly typical negotiation.
Were there any issues about wording for this investigation?
Well, there were a lot of lawyers involved, so there were certainly, yes, there were issues about wording. There were definitional issues. What would be included in allegations of sexual misconduct? What would be considered a valid or confirmed allegation of misconduct versus a rumor? What was a credible report? And as Attorney General, I wanted to make that a broad definition because I wanted as many victims as possible to be acknowledged. And I wanted to name the priests who perhaps have been involved in grooming activity, but we might not have evidence of sexual contact with a child, and yet that behavior of having a sleepover, touching a child, asking for photographs of them, giving them gifts that were inappropriate or over the top. Those are all important things to acknowledge as grooming activity that is part of abuse by someone in a position of trust.
So you pushed to get that included in the investigation. And is that ultimately what was added in?
It was added, as well as the fact that the special master was given the authority to conduct interviews. Initially, the church was reticent about anything more than a review of the files that they were producing to the independent reviewer, the special master. And as prosecutors in the Attorney General's office, we said there are going to be times where the special master and his team need to be able to reach out to those victims to understand whether something was a credible allegation of abuse. And we know that the people who are going to work on this are going to be considerate of what's involved in a victim retelling a story, but we have to have the authority to be able to have those delicate conversations in order to do the report. And that was an area where we were eventually able to convince the church that that was something that needed to be included, that ability to reach out.
When the three of you would sit and talk about this investigation and launching it essentially in August, did you ever have a moment where you go, this could be really big for Colorado and this could have a really big impact on our community?
I felt that way from the beginning, that if we were able to have an agreement with the church and have a special master be able to look at the records of the church and conduct interviews, it would be big. And I knew that from talking to victims who said, if you can get an acknowledgement from the Catholic Church that something bad happened to me when I was a child and that they didn't do the right thing at that point. They didn't discipline that priest. They didn't take that priest out of the ministry. But instead, that person was allowed to continue to abuse children. That is an enormous victory for us psychologically and emotionally. And all the way along in our discussions through the beginning of January of 2019, we all knew that this was something big and something extremely important to victims of sexual abuse.
You were up against a really tight timeline by the end of the year before administrations changed. What was your motivation for that persistence to get as much done as possible in that 3 months?
I think that one of the most significant roles of an attorney general is to protect the constituency and to protect children. And Phil Weiser, my successor, has said the same thing, that we are in a special position of power to be able to provide protection and truth to people. It was very important to me before I left office to be able to do that for victims of child sex abuse. And I hope that it opens the door for other institutions to be accountable for what happens in their churches and their sports organizations, in a variety of ways that adults interact with kids, and that there is abuse. To be a moral authority, to have a higher power over a child, one has to be open and transparent and honest to earn that moral authority.
Did you ever feel like it was you and your team, 3 women, taking on the Catholic Church?
Yes. It did feel that way at times. And through the negotiations, mainly with a group of men, and certainly the representatives of the Catholic Church themselves, the priests, the Archbishop were male. There were times when we were the women at the table, and we were having a conversation with a group of men. And when you're talking about issues of child sex abuse and things that are very delicate and sensitive, those can be awkward conversations to have, particularly when you're having them between both genders. And so there were times where that was, in fact, very sensitive, and I did feel like the women were doing their best to have a voice on behalf of the children.
Was there any instance where you felt like you were treated, the team was treated differently because you were women at the table?
No, I appreciate the fact that that was not the case. I felt like there was mutual respect among the attorneys. My conversation with the Archbishop was, it was very open, it was very candid, it was respectful, but we did push back on each other about what was happening and why this type of independent review was necessary. And I think the church was at a place where certainly some of its leadership agreed that the air would never be clear unless there was some historical account up to today of what has happened in terms of clergy sex abuse on children.
And I wanted to go back to what you first said. So when you first talked to the church, they said that they didn't think that there was any problem since you said 1988?
1998.
1998. Did you find that to be true, or what did you find with that, or was that answer satisfactory to you?
I rely on what Bob Troyer wrote in his report, and there is language that addresses the fact that he has a concern, and his team did, that the records and processes of the Catholic Church in Colorado are still flawed, and that because of that record keeping not necessarily being complete, that he and his team were not able to tell whether in fact there had been cases since 1998, because the information was not there in the form that was needed to prove or disprove that. And there's a paragraph where he is, I think, very clear in saying the church must improve its processes and its documentation in order for there to be real oversight of what is happening in terms of clergy child sex abuse.
When you handed over the investigation to Phil Weiser's administration, was that investigation still going on at that point, or what was the status?
It had actually not started.
Okay.
So the agreement had been completed, but it was important that we had buy-in, obviously, from the next administration. That was important to the church. It was going to be important to the next Attorney General. It was very important to me and my team that we knew the project we had worked on and this really legacy project would be carried forward. And we knew we were handing Attorney General Weiser a major project that we had negotiated on behalf of the state, but that he and his team would be responsible for carrying out. And so it was very important to have continuity and buy-in in that transition. And I'm so pleased that that happened and that General Weiser did carry forward, begin that investigation and have Bob Troyer conduct that investigation starting in February of 2019, just very shortly after he took office.
You know, you had a very unique perspective as this played out over the majority of 2019 of knowing what it took to even start that investigation. What was it like to watch the information coming out, the priests named, the victims reacting to the priests being named? There is a real mix of emotions
in what has transpired since the report came out. I was initially just so happy that our initial deadline had been met, that the report was completed, that it was as extensive as it was, that Bob Troyer and his team had been able to see records and conduct interviews and piece together the story of the past and the present, and to make recommendations that I think will protect children in the future. When I read the report, it really, at many points, just brought me to tears. To hear the stories of victims, the abuse that was endured, the hiding of that information by people in positions of trust who should have owned what happened that was bad and done something to protect children. I also felt some significant outrage, righteous indignation over the fact that there was an average of almost 20 years that passed between the time a priest would first be, there would first be a complaint against a priest about sex abuse, and the time action would be taken against that priest to remove him from a position where he could abuse other children. And the fact that so many children suffered abuse in that window of time and didn't have to. They did not have to be victims. They did not have to have their lives forever altered and go through that crushing experience. And it could have been prevented. That is what makes me the most sad.
How significant of a case was this for you to launch this investigation, personally?
It was tremendously important. During my time as Attorney General, I made the prevention of sex abuse and sex assault a priority. And part of the reason was because I had been a victim myself as a child. So it was deeply personal to me to address the issue and to acknowledge that as a society, we have not done everything that we could do to keep children safe. Institutional abuse rose to the surface as an issue because of the stories about the Olympic gymnastics team and the abuse that those young women suffered. That was present in the media. The issues of the Catholic Church, once again, were surfaced through the Pennsylvania grand jury report. And all along the way, we've heard about abuse in other arenas, other denominations, other churches, schools, sports teams, scouting organizations. And I felt very much that while I had power and a voice as Attorney General, that voice needed to be the voice for victims and for the vulnerable who couldn't speak for themselves.
You had explained a little bit about the funding for this investigation and the decisions you made in the interest of the victims. Can you explain a little bit about how that worked?
There obviously was a cost to the independent investigation, and as we negotiated the agreement, we needed to make provisions. How would we pay Bob Troyer's team? Because it was not only going to be Mr. Troyer, but he needed additional people helping him. This was a vast amount of information, and we were compressing review into a short period of time, and he needed resources. He gave us a very reasonable rate, at which to do that work. I think because for him it also is a personal issue of passion and responsibility for children. We agreed that the church would pay for half of the investigation, half of those costs, and the Attorney General's office would pay for the other half. We didn't realize just how complicated that would become for us in the Attorney General's office, but as we looked at statutes and confidentiality and the open record statutes, we became quite concerned that if we used public resources, we could potentially be exposing victims to having their personal information shared. And to me, if there was any risk of that, we would be re-victimizing those who had been victims as children, and we couldn't run that risk. So we had to find other sources of funding. The church placed some conditions on that, and some of that is confidential because of the negotiations that we did, but it made it more challenging to find folks to help fund this. And I eventually, over Thanksgiving break in 2018, I just saw that the train was coming at me. I knew I had very little time to raise the money that needed to be raised to fund the report. And so I spent that week calling people that I knew who could be potential funders, and folks who were civic leaders, folks who had compassion for children, folks who wanted to see the church take accountability, and some of those were folks who were Catholic, some were not. And I called those folks and just made my plea to them: can you help us get to our goal? Because we have to do this before the end of the year. And I was so pleased that I found those people. Yeah. And they came forward and they said, yes, we'll help you with this project. We think this is very important.
So it was private donors that covered the $150,000. Mm-hmm. And you were saying it was so that you couldn't CORA the records or the investigation and potentially get a victim's name to protect their identity.
Exactly.
Right?
We wanted to be certain that, yes, it wasn't designed to protect the church. I want people to know that and understand that. It was designed to protect the victims and personal information, and to just be absolutely certain that some detail would not come out that would identify one of those individuals.
Was there anything about the investigation that you wish you could have incorporated or wish could have been probed?
There were, of course, some limitations that we had to agree to on behalf of the state and victims. That things that I would like to know and still would, we were not able to include priests who were seminarians at the time of an allegation of abuse. We were not able to include religious order priests, or actually nuns, because there have been allegations that I have heard that there were nuns who were involved in sexual abuse, physical abuse of children. And we did not include adult victims. We were focused on children. Sure. So there were definitely parameters around the investigation that I would rather not have had there. But in the time we had, and with the authority, the limited legal authority that the Attorney General has to conduct an investigation of this sort, I think we did the very best that we possibly could for victims. And I think the report has turned out to be an outstanding way of beginning to tell the story for victims. I consider it a first chapter in a book. And I believe that Attorney General Weiser feels the same. He has said his job is to protect children and to make sure that the details that need to come out do and see the light of day.
When you say first chapter, what do you mean by that? What do you think needs to come next?
I think we, and I'll refer to the, certainly to the recommendations that Bob Troyer made, because I think those are outstanding. Yeah. But I think it's important to know who kept the information private, who hid the details of the priests who committed abuse and allowed 20 years to pass between an allegation of abuse and the time that action was taken against a priest. Who allowed those 100 or more, and I'm sure that's the tip of the iceberg, those hundreds of victims to be abused, who thought it was more important to protect the priesthood and the church than it was to protect child victims. I want to know who those folks are. And they may not be living, and they may not be in an active role in the church anymore. But I think what's important when you have this type of systemic institutional abuse, in order to rid an organization of that culture, you have to shine a light on everything that happened. And it's not just the initial act of abuse, but it's what happened afterward to cover that up.
I wanted to bring up that there's a Senate candidate, Andrew Romanoff, who has been criticizing then Governor John Hickenlooper about not initiating a grand jury investigation. I wanted to know if you had any conversations with the governor about this and asked the governor for assistance in this investigation.
Governor Hickenlooper and I spoke a couple of times about this issue. I, of course, knew that undertaking any type of investigation of the church was going to be a major issue, and that he needed to know as governor what was happening across the street at the Attorney General's office and be aware of it. Without revealing details of a confidential conversation, I mean, we talked about the challenges of getting an investigation done that would be thorough, that would name those who had been guilty of abuse, that would protect victims, and that could happen in October, November, December, when both the governor and I were leaving office and knew that time was short. We both agreed that if the church would come voluntarily to the table and be a part of sharing in an agreement, that would be the best thing. But I think had we had more time, both the governor and I, to explore options, we might have reached a different conclusion. But it is a major step and a rare thing for a governor to essentially authorize the Attorney General to begin an investigation that could take a case to the grand jury. And it was a major decision in the waning hours of both of our administrations.
My last question for you was that, did you feel like you had the support and the resources to be able to launch this investigation, or were there any moments where there was something you needed and it just happened to be out of reach?
It certainly would have been my preference to have a case to take to the grand jury. Sure. But we didn't have a current allegation of clergy sex abuse on a child within the criminal statute of limitations that would allow us to go to a grand jury. And we felt that if we opened the door, we did an independent review, and we said to victims, you can come to us, you can come to the Attorney General's office, to a victim's advocate, to someone who has been in the position you're in, and you can tell us your story, and you can trust that we will not only respect your privacy and confidentiality, but we will do everything we can to hold people accountable. And it is possible that Those cases are out there. We know that the average victim waits until they're 52 years of age. Those who are abused as minors don't talk about this until they are well into adulthood for a variety of reasons. And we may not have heard from those folks. So having a shortened statute of limitations on the civil side really harms the victims of abuse, and it can protect the abuser in the institution.
Subscribe to the Next YouTube channel for the best of Next and some other stuff.